give you just a tidbit of information because you'd much rather hear from her than from me. Sara Zewde characterizes herself as a landscape designer, urbanist, and public artist. Zewde specializes in the design of the contemporary southern city, design and development in historically black neighborhoods, the history and memory of the transatlantic slave trade, and the politics of public space. She's founding principal of Studio Zewde, recognized for distinctive methodology which connects site interpretation with a design process by narrative and construction of the finest quality. Sara holds an MLA from Harvard Graduate School of Design, a Master's of City Planning from MIT, a BA in Sociology and Statistics from Boston University. She's the recipient of a lot of awards, including the Silverberg Memorial Award for Urban Design, the Hebert Award for contributions to the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. In 2014, she was a Landscape Architecture Foundation National Olmsted Scholar, just like our own Angelique Easley. We're very proud of that. In 2016, she was Artist in Residence at the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation. In 2018, Sara was named to the National Trust for Historic Preservation's inaugural 40 Under 40 People Saving Places list. And at the University of Texas at Austin last year, Sara served as a fellow in the new initiative on race and gender in the built environment. I am delighted that Sara was able to take time from her amazing work to visit with us. And by the way, if you have a chance to talk with her, ask her how it is that her studio is now located in Harlem, New York. It's a great story. Anyway, please join me in welcoming Sara Zewde.
Is this any better? Okay. So I want to thank everyone here for hosting me for the day. You guys have been extremely hospitable. I've been telling people that I've gotten the best questions from any university so far today. So your questions and the conversations that I've had over the course of the day have left me reflecting on things and issues that I care about in a new way. So thank you for that. You guys, meaning the students, you guys are arguably among the first to come of age in design disciplines that are directly confronting a series of serious issues, from the breakneck speed of contemporary urban development, a rapidly changing climate, and the clarified social and political tensions of the Anthropocene. I told the students in ProPrac today that I wouldn't take it lightly, that you guys are actually in a safe space, in an academic space at a time when these issues are being confronted by a design discourse. That's a luxury that even I myself didn't have when I was being trained. So we're expecting a lot out of you guys. In 2005, I myself, I grew up in Louisiana, and I watched a storm brew and barrel towards my home state from a college dorm in Boston. The aftermath of that prompted me to investigate the disciplinary realms that could wrestle with the social, cultural, and ecological factors that could manifest a Hurricane Katrina. What I found in landscape architecture at the time was a field aiming to take on the growing urban ecological challenge, fighting to adopt a scientific framework, and challenging itself to develop new systems-based approaches to design. And I found that to be productive and fruitful for the field, but yet and still I didn't find in the discipline the same kind of restless intellectual energy invested in the people side of the equation. To me, I felt there was an intellectual imbalance. I felt that when we talked about ecological design, that people were portrayed as passive. Their lives, their culture, their land, serving as the terrain upon which landscape architecture and its new ecological way of thinking would be applied. So I was always curious about how stories might emerge in the contemporary practice of landscape architecture as it positions itself to tackle these large-scale challenges and sort of recenter this intellectual imbalance. In the search of a fitting testing ground for these questions, I have ultimately based much of my research in the American South, as was mentioned in the intro. In the South, the presence of stories in the land is particularly clear and the challenges immense. The American South is sacred ground. It's ground that is deeply tied to complex cultural memory. Every day we walk a constellation of sites of trauma, of torture, as well as of joy, of triumph, and immeasurable self-determination. Frederick Law Olmsted himself came to the same conclusion about the significance of the American South. Olmsted tirelessly documented the conditions of enslavement when he was hired by the New York Times to travel to slave states from 1852 to 1854, writing about the conditions of slavery in a narrative voice. So this is, I spent 4 months at Dunbar and Oaks earlier this year going through his archives, his personal letters, and also going through the New York Daily Times, which is now the New York Times archives, and reviewing where he was in his thinking as he traveled the South. He would go on to write contemporaneously for the New York Times about what he saw in the slave states, but he would return and to enter the competition for the Central Park Design Commission. At the same time as working on Central Park, he was republishing his writings with a more staunchly abolitionist, a more progressive position on post-abolition America. He would publish his observations in a book called Cotton Kingdom, published just 6 weeks before the first shots fired at Fort Sumter. So, in reading his personal letters, I also was inspired to retrace his steps through the South. And so I took, this is kind of an amalgamation of the 3 trips he took. And I specifically took the itinerary that was published in Cotton Kingdom. What I found in site after site, in comparing what I saw in the places today with what Olmsted saw 165 years ago, is a near complete erasure of any part of the conditions Olmsted documented about the world that he was witness to. In many instances, it was landscape architecture that was used as the tool for erasure or for recasting the truth about what happened in the South. So, in an ironic twist of fate, the discipline that Olmsted himself advocated for would go on to be the tool for muting the stories he believed were so important to tell. But can the reverse be true? Can Olmsted's landscape architecture be employed to surface these stories in meaningful ways? What are the methods for design to tell people stories that are embedded in the earth? What are the methods of interpretation? And how can people's stories inspire new approaches to working in the context of society's biggest challenges? This is where I position my work, in the methods and practice of interpretation. I've used practice as a way to reflect on these questions, and tonight I'll share with you select projects that demonstrate this process. Starting in Houston, Texas. This is Friedmans Town, a neighborhood constructed by freed slaves in 1866 on a swampy backwater that was then unwanted. Its location on the soggy banks of Buffalo Bayou, its flat topography, and its impervious clayey soils made the site prone to frequent flooding. The bayou was lined with tall and gnarly grasses and a haven for mosquitoes. Despite its proximity to the center of Houston, these unpalatable attributes meant it had not been settled in 1866, the year of emancipation. And so the first freed slaves departed the Brazos River cotton plantations, entering Houston from the west. So we're talking about this site here. So this is downtown Houston, and as you see, this site is actually peculiarly not settled, and that's why this is the site for the establishment of the Friedmans Town. They cleared the dense, muddy marsh, they constructed their own homes, they made their own bricks to pave their own streets, all services that the city of Houston refused them. And in their planning of the neighborhood, they designated some of the lots remain perpetually unbuilt to mitigate flooding. They figured the open space could double as space for worshiping and gathering, as well as for mitigating flooding. So using the shrubs and the twigs from the bayou, these brush arbors were actually set up on the open water retaining lots to facilitate this mixed use. And quickly, Friedmans Town became the civic heart of Black Houston, home to teachers, shop owners, lawyers, and doctors. Over time, a series of traumas have continued to wipe away the structures and the people in them. A freeway bisecting the neighborhood, large-scale urban renewal projects, and of late, extreme development pressure given its proximity to downtown. Moreover, urbanization of the surrounding area has compounded flooding and water quality in the bayou. So through a series of planning efforts over the last few years, people have expressed this desire to upgrade the neighborhood's infrastructure, but to do so in a way that speaks to the memory and the culture of this place. So in 2013, the city commissioned an engineering firm to do sub-drainage work on Genesee Street. And that firm subcontracted a small landscape firm local to Houston that I happened to be working at. And the engineers basically, they looked to the landscape architects to tell them where to put the trees, right? And where to put the benches. And they kind of sort of flippantly were like, could we also maybe put a plaque or something about the history? They were like, oh, maybe African symbols or something. But I wanted to challenge ourselves to think more about what could happen here. And so I took the opportunity to investigate a little bit more about what the settlers built here originally and how that it could inspire the design of a streetscape. So I traced the architectural typology of Friedmans Town, so that's here, to the Yoruba, which is an ethnic group in West Africa. Enslaved West Africans were brought to Haiti, where that architectural tradition continued. And during the Haitian Revolution, very bloody Haitian Revolution, lots of the population actually migrated to Louisiana, to New Orleans, which was also a French-speaking colony. So from New Orleans, this architectural tradition actually spread through the bayous of Southeast Texas, and that's how it's present in Friedmans Town today. You'll note also that by orienting the shorter end of the home along the street, the settlers achieved a greater density of facades on each block, which had a profound effect on the social nature of the streets. The facades were in alignment with one another with virtually no setback. The ubiquity of the porch created a gallery of spaces that punctured the streetscape, blurring the delineation between public and private. This public offering of the private facades was intimately tied to people's association with this place. So I took this opportunity to study the structures while some of them still remain. I went out in different seasons and times of day to record the qualities of light and noting the patterns created by the stairs, porches, windows, and doors. I took note of the paving pattern the original settlers laid. You'll note that along the roadways you see this orthogonal pattern of the bricks, but then when you arrive at an intersection, that pattern breaks and forms a sort of diagonal. And some of the older guys hanging out in the neighborhood relayed to me that this is a tradition that the settlers consciously built into the paving pattern that was brought from West Africa as well. And the intention here was to mark the intersection as a space of ritual. And so I felt we had the opportunity to frame our streetscape in a similar way, incorporating the historic bricks that were of a condition, a salvageable condition, concentrating them at the intersections, elevating them sectionally, tabling the intersection. And we were also asked to have some sort of wall. This is a public school, and they wanted a wall here. And so instead of just a wall, I proposed abstracting the dimensions of the historic structures and creating these black concrete panels, their color and their material signifying the modesty of the original structures. So, the idea is we're not just going to put a plaque. Thinking back, on the culture of this place and the philosophy of time embedded in a lot of African diasporic traditions, time is largely influenced by the past, the future. Any notion of the future is embedded in the past. And so while this is not a historic preservation project or viewing the past as an artifact or something to be recreated, it's an interpretation of the past. And it's a new space that aims to invite the types of interaction and intimacy the neighborhood has borne witness to over time. So I simulated both sunlight and artificial light, testing the shadow patterns that these panels might cast on the street, and proposed the actual wood panels from the structures to form the concrete walls, such that the walls would become casts of the structures and sort of an imprint of their grain. The planting would be central to providing shade in the Houston heat, but also to the spatial narrative. The leaves of the tall grasses and the banana plants, the fishtail palms and the weeping willows stretch through the cutout doors and windows, their thick, heavy swampiness speaking to the bayou edge the settlers dwelled in. So on one block, so this is all city-owned, and this is owned by the school district. So essentially, as the school district started to understand what we were moving towards here, they offered up this portion of Andrew Street to incorporate into the project. And where we weren't able to convince the city to do a curbless street profile here, we were able to propose that for this section of the street. And that curbless street profile offered the opportunity to integrate rain gardens to collect and filter stormwater, punctuated by a series of vine-covered arbors, recalling that idea of the original settlers had of these open lots holding water, but also holding gathering. So, as landscape architects in a project like this, we're usually asked to propose where the trees go, the benches go, and the curbs go. And we did all of that, but with this notion of interpretation of the past, we challenged ourselves to evolve the form of the media that landscape architects traditionally use, and use them, deploy them to engage with the neighborhood's cultural ecology in a productive way. Moving on to Philadelphia. Who here is familiar with Fairmount Park? Okay, quite a few people. Significant part of Philadelphia's park system. So this is a project that our office worked on largely in 2018. This is in the Strawberry Mansion community in North Philadelphia. So the museum district is just south of here, Brewery Town. Some of the development pressures slowly starting to creep north. And we were asked to come up with a landscape plan for this 22-acre portion around what is lovingly known as the Mander Recreation Center. One of the things that we noticed as we entered this project was the concentration of amenities in the southeast corner of the park. One of the things that we learned in this project was the historical legacy of the Parks Department being segregated from the Recreation Department. Historically, the Parks Department was white in Philadelphia, and the Recreation Department was black. And that is basically what we see manifest in this aerial. The Recreation Department developed all of these amenities and concentrated that towards the edge of this community. This Strawberry Mansion community is 97% black, and the interior, the closer you get to the Schuylkill River, is perceived as white. And in fact, this Reservoir Drive is perceived as the dividing line. And people still, to this day, while those two departments have come together now, this street is still considered the dividing line between Strawberry Mansion, its community, and Mander Rec, and that of Fairmount Park broadly. So a master plan had already been done prior to us coming into the project. And what you see here, so there's that Reservoir Drive. What you see here is, in that original plan, is highlighting investment between Reservoir Drive and Schuylkill River, which doesn't align with how the neighborhood uses the site, which is here. And so to them, it was frustrating that the master plan did not acknowledge where they believe that investment should be, which is the social heart of the neighborhood at the southeast corner of the site. And so that frustration led to our commissioning to try to come up with a plan that would resolve and speak to their desires. So this is the existing site conditions. If you look at this public park recreation center, you might not think it's anything notable. But for the people in this place, I mean, these are some archival photos that some of the residents brought to us. Their love for this place is rooted in generations of play, of activity, of sports, of barbecues, of gathering, of first kisses, of, this is, people call it the neighborhood's front yard. And we used these images in a lot of our engagement with people to just open up the conversation about what do you love about this place? What's your favorite memory here? What's your favorite story here? People, the older folks are convinced that they can find themselves in these photos, which is very fun. Sports is a big part of why this place is important to people in the neighborhood. Strawberry Mansion is one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in America. In fact, Strawberry Mansion High School is the most violent high school in America. So to come here and play sports is the place to get away. And so we spent a lot of time just watching kids and understanding how spatially that plays out on the field. So another look at the recreation center. Again, it itself, while, if you look at it objectively, you might not think it's anything notable, but really there's so many layers of memories embedded in that place. We found this Jet magazine from 1952 on Black Supermen, and it highlights Joseph Mander, who the rec center is named after. In 1951, he died trying to save a 7-year-old boy who was white who had fallen into the river. They both died, actually. And so in 1952, this Sarah Wright, a famous poet, wrote this poem, and one of the community members brought it to us, and it really shaped our approach to the project. I'll just read a few lines. She says, "Now I have seen monuments, great geometric heaps of stone, lifeless towers raised to keep alive the dead. But I ask, cannot a monument that breathes be built?" And so that really launched us into thinking about the park itself being a living monument. So our first engagement event, we came to the community with nothing drawn, no site analysis done, but we said, let's celebrate this place today. There's a lot to love here. There's a lot to be proud of. So we threw a block party. We had about 150 people come out. We had a DJ, we had barbecue. At a certain point, we switched out the food for, well, I'll tell you that part later. There was t-shirt making. We made this little logo, I love Mander, with a strawberry for Strawberry Mansion. So had you not known, I mean, we didn't say this is, a community meeting where you can come learn about. No, this is a celebration, and so it attracted people that may have not otherwise ever come to something like this. And so we had prompts like this. Mander is a place too. So we were able to understand, what do people associate this place with? And having this kind of event on the site became a site analysis tool in and of itself. It gave us a concentrated sense of activation and what people are drawn to and how. At a certain point during the block party, we switched out the food for aerial maps. And we asked people, we had people get together in 6 groups, and they had to make a collage together about what they love about Mander. And putting them in a group with one another to come up with a collective vision actually relieved us of being, the us versus them kind of dimension, and actually brought people in conversation with one another, trying to figure out the priorities of this place. And so the other thing that we did was we had those 6 groups then present to the larger group about their visions. And that gave us a chance to hear them articulate, understand their word language and what kinds of things that they're emphasizing. And that was a really important launching point for us for the design process. We took those 6 collages and, instead of looking at them as a one-to-one kind of like, here's what I want image, just because there are flowers in this corner doesn't mean they necessarily want a garden there. But we looked at it, we analyzed them in terms of larger patterns and structures. What is the gestalt that is embedded in the collage? Where are the concentrations of activities happening? And then we really essentialized those collages into what we identified as 3 emergent priorities. One was activating 33rd Street, so that's this urban edge here. While the current concentration of activities is here, you could see in the collages a desire to pull north, which also speaks to the fact that the northern part of this neighborhood has little access to any other public spaces. And so we wanted to speak to that stretching of activity to the northern edge. The other is, while there is this divide at Reservoir Drive, really the clustering of activity is still here. And people did talk about in their presentations especially, how do we make people feel like this is their space? How do we invite them in to maximize the use of, at a minimum, up to Reservoir Drive? The third thing was people wanted a legible way to move around this place. The site currently is this collection of facilities and lawn, very, very little in terms of any sort of satisfying circulation or legibility around the site. And especially the older folks, they wanted a way to clearly be able to walk around the site and see everything that's going on. Those 3 things really did pretty directly form the structure of our vision plan. So what you see below is the base plan for our landscape, our proposed landscape. So here you see the sort of promenade of 33rd Street, literally bringing you into the heart of the sort of legacy corner. We've expanded the recreation center building footprint 3 times the square footage that it was. We were working with Jigsaw Architects, and using that as an anchor to facilitate views and circulation into a new heart of the park, and centering the sports that are already so central to the neighborhood, and literally shaping the ground around that to reflect back to this heart. And so while the topography is reflective of the fact that this really is the heart of the neighborhood, the circulation itself is encouraging the crossing of Reservoir Drive. So we've proposed a number of mid-block crossings in order to facilitate safe crossing. We don't want to continue to reinforce the fact that people don't cross it, but at the same time we want to respect the fact that this already is the social heart of the neighborhood. So the tree canopy is really reflective of all of this. This being sort of a memorial plaza, shaping again the heart and the open field, bringing into view the sports and the activities and the picnicking that are the central activity here. We also we proposed the programming as, we framed it as a memory plan. A lot of the memories that people shared with us, we said, if this landscape is done well, it will be able to support and amplify the continuation of those activities into the future, right? So for instance, people talked about their memories of hill play, which historically they had access to this reservoir, and they used to run up and down these hills. So that actually inspired our the grading here and offering hill play so that that memory can continue into the future. This is the place where everybody has their family reunions. That was a memory that we got consistently. So being able to design a whole area of the park specific to those memories, you know, that memory is not a thing we're talking about in the past, but it's in fact, it's shaping our future. It's shaping the vision of the park. So these are the three main kind of segments of the park: Mander Fields, Mander Plaza, and then the garden walk up 33rd Street. Again, these are those connections that I was speaking to, the circulation being the connective tissue that challenges Reservoir Drive as that divider. John Coltrane actually grew up in this neighborhood, and what you see on the left is a sketch that he did of, not only did he live in this neighborhood, he actually lived on 33rd Street right here. And the left is a sketch that he did of what he called the mathematics of jazz music. And you know, there was this insistence from residents of like, how do we tell the story of the people that are from here? Meek Mill is also from this neighborhood. He is. Sounds like you do. And so without going too much into the theory of this drawing, what we did was we used it as actually an approach to forming circulation across the landscape plan. Essentially, it became literally a paving pattern and an armature for inscriptions in the ground that would tell the stories of the notable figures of the neighborhood. So this is kind of what that looks like on the ground. This is coming through the Memorial Plaza in that southeast corner, offering a space for both inscriptions for the mile markers, but also a place to, again, tell the stories, move you across the site. If in fact, you had the desire to learn about those notable figures, that this would function for that as well. So this is that picnic grove for cookouts. Meek Mill joined this particular cookout. This is the garden walk bringing you down 33rd into the heart of the park. And this is at the Mander Memorial Plaza, is a water feature that we are proposing basically at the sort of edge of the plaza overlooking the athletic fields. And what we're showing here is the inscription of that poem that the resident brought to our attention about the living monument. So as you look out on the real living monument, you're reflecting again on the words and the legacy of Joseph Mander as you do that. So now let's go to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. This is the Valongo Wharf in Rio de Janeiro. This is a painting, 1835, called Desembarque, which means arrival. The Valongo Wharf was the point of arrival for about 22% of, well, let me put it like this. 22% of all of the Africans brought to the Americas via the transatlantic slave trade passed through Rio de Janeiro. And for millions of them, the Valongo Wharf specifically was their point of arrival. This is the point that their feet touched the land in the New World for the first time. That's what this painting is depicting. This is an image of the Guanabara Bay the year before slavery was abolished in 1888. So this image would have been taken from this hill overlooking the water. So this is the historic coastline. Since the abolition of slavery, there have been a number of landfilling operations that have brought the coastline to this point today. And so this is the Valongo Wharf itself, the jetty that went out into the water. This is the journey that the ships would have made, transfer here to skiffs, and then to the jetty. So what that landfilling did was it meant that this jetty was built on top of and removed entirely from view all of these years until 2011, when construction, 2010 actually, December 2010, when construction in preparation for the World Cup and the Olympics prompted this infrastructure project, and the construction workers found the stone jetty perfectly preserved about 6 feet below the street. So that year, I received a research grant from Harvard to ask the mayor's office my research question directly. So what had happened was this discovery was made, and the city was kind of going to just put everything back. And the activists in the Black community mostly, basically stood up and said, you have to do something here. This is the most significant material discovery of the transatlantic slave trade in the Americas. And so the mayor was in the newspaper saying, okay, we're gonna design something that's gonna represent the Black experience in Brazil. When I saw that in the newspapers, that was the grant, that was the research question I wanted to explore. So that was my question, what does it mean to represent the Black experience in design? And I went to Rio and I asked the mayor's office, and they were like, we don't know. And they said, do you know? And could you design it? So I said yes. That was my first year of design school. I said yes, and I began working with them in the mayor's office and working with the community on developing a design for the site and its environs, and this project is still ongoing. Walking into this, I knew what the mayor's office and the community actually had in mind. The typology of the memorial is rooted in classical notions of monumentality. Memorials are fashioned around the notion of an event, a war, a hero, a triumph, a tragedy, to trigger emotions outside of the everyday, typifying the notion of architecture as an isolated object. And even though their forms may change over time, as shown in this graphic, memorials tend to reinforce similar spatial traditions of distance, slowness, walking, removedness, stillness, guilt, silence, and a regulation of the body, no matter the form that they take. This is the kind of grand narrative of the memorial. And even memorials that speak to slavery tend to co-opt similar formal languages, leaving unresolved the fact that slavery was not an event. It was 400 years of the way the world operated, and its effects are still present today. So the Yoruba, which again, that West African ethnic group whose philosophy has formed the basis of a lot of Afro-diasporic philosophy, their thinking is very present in Afro-Brazilian cosmology and the notions of time. And so in order to look forward, you must look back. And Africans in Brazil look to the landscape to orient their consciousness of time and memory. So this geomorphological mapping of the slave trade actually reveals that the Valongo port touched what is now Southwest Africa about 300 million years ago. So this dot represents the Valongo Wharf. And this red represents the Lattisolate tropical red soil region. Africans actively brought plant species with them on the ships and informed seeds, which adapted and flourished in the Brazilian landscape to reconstruct plant-based rituals. So in this drawing you see the slave trade routes in gray, and the shared soil region in Africa and the Americas, and the spread of plants and cultures between them. So these hatches represent different Afro-American traditions that relate to these plants. You also see the predominant winds over the Atlantic. So species like beach morning glory and gourd species that have flotation devices actually made the same trip as the Africans, but a few hundred years prior. So when the Africans landed in the Americas and saw those coastal plants, they knew that their gods were present. That's the story that's told. So zooming into that dot right there, which is the Valongo Wharf, this is the view that the Africans would have had arriving into the port. So this is the ship coming into the Guanabara Bay. This is the transfer onto the skiffs to the stone jetty. If you were dead on arrival, you were taken down this street to the open burial ground. If you were sick on arrival, you were also taken down this street to the slave hospital, where they would try to make your condition better to get a better price for you. If you escaped, you would likely come up these hills and form a quilombo or a free community on the hilltops. And if you were alive and well, relatively speaking, on arrival, you would be taken down this street down this valley to this triangular plaza here called the Deposit, where you'd be fattened and tamed for a 2 to 3 week period in order to get a better price for you. And during that period, you were being housed in these warehouses that line the street until ultimately you would be taken to one of the plazas or side streets for where the point of sale would happen. You would be sold likely to a plantation, although there was some urban slavery, but largely you'd be taken out to the region. So when I linked this historical analysis, this bottom layer, to the drawing of the contemporary city, I found that a lot of these spaces that were formed from this industry actually exist today with no marker of what happened there. And that's what was really revealing about doing this analysis was, in order to support this industry, in order to buy and sell and ship millions of people, you had to build a city, and that is the city that we know today. Overlaying that with the mayor's redevelopment plan for the Olympics and the World Cup, the opportunity to speak about this history needed to be expanded beyond just the stone jetty, but really to speak to the scale of the industry itself. And so I came back to the mayor's office and with this layer and said, this is the memorial. And they were like, well, isn't that what we asked you to do? We just wanted like a wall of names or something. But I, was really interested in this idea of how people, like the memory is still there. There may not be any memorials, but the memory is still there in a lot of different ways. In Afro-Brazilian culture, that memory is often communicated through ritual, through practice, through song, through the plants themselves. And so I started doing this sort of notational exercise to keep track of all of the ways that the memory of this legacy is expressed in everyday life in and around the site. Let's see if this works. So I'm just going to take you to one of those drawings and show you how this process works. No, it won't. Okay. Well, there was an animation. Essentially, this diagram I showed in motion. This is the notation of a capoeira, which is an Afro-Brazilian martial arts. And to make the case, essentially, that the memory is actually embedded in these uses of space. And so if the design approach is centered around reinforcing these activities, then that's the approach to speaking directly to the cultural memory of this place. The continuation of these things is how we can speak to this legacy. I'm sorry that didn't work, but it's really cool, I promise. So this is the sort of master plan, or I like to call it more of a strategic plan for this constellation of sites. So again, moving from just the memorial at the site to a whole regional plan for speaking to this memory. And I'll take you through a couple of the sites. We can start here at the archaeological site of the stone jetty. Sorry, so taking a step back, I guess. This is, what this strategic plan ultimately produced was 7 concrete capital projects that as those parcels go online for redevelopment via the mayor's redevelopment plan, that this would be the land, this would trigger a sort of commissioning of this particular piece of the memory plan. Each one of those projects incorporates vegetation brought from Africa. interesting side note, these species are, you're not allowed to plant them in public landscapes because they're technically not considered native species. But we made the case to them that, well, you know, native, what's native? The definition of native is essentially based on which plants were present when the Europeans arrived, which is an arbitrary moment in the constant evolution of plants and humans. And so these plants, in theory, you know, they enjoy the same soil profile, they do have a longer trajectory of connection, and so because of their relevance, we should consider that. And so they actually relaxed their policy and allowed us to propose planting these species. Okay, so we'll go to the jetty. So you see here there's this obelisk in the way. And this obelisk is to the Portuguese empress, which, you know, is kind of the equivalent of having a Confederate statue on top of a slave site. So we were like, look, you know, the activists actually were saying, the community members were saying, can the city remove it? Can they move it over? But the city said no. She has a part in Rio's history, not particular to the site, but just to Rio's history, and so we have to deal with it. So the community asked me, okay, so can you design something taller than that? So we like win. But my approach was to say, you know, okay, so in this particular case, height is being used as a demonstration of power within the context of a European architectural tradition, which we could argue about where the obelisk comes from, but in this particular case, that's what's happening. And can we mine Afro-Brazilian definitions of power to form a stronger dialogue with the obelisk? That led us to the ficus genus. It's a genus that is native to both continents. Species-wise, they evolved separately over 150 million years. But the ficus happens to be the genus in Afro-Brazilian and West African cosmology that represents where the ancestors gather. That the base of the tree is where the ancestors gather, and they often mark that with a wrapping of white fabric or the construction of white walls around its base. And so the idea of wrapping became a point of inquiry, of creative inquiry for us. This is just a random model that I was testing about a form that actually led to an approach to circulation around the archaeological site, a wrapping. And so we have, this is a favela where the descendants of this history live. This is the sea, this is the archaeological site, and so we started to form a wrapping around two rough circles in the sense that these could be the places for those circular Afro-Brazilian traditions to take place. We're also offering, proposing a grove of ficus trees, offering shade, but also speaking directly to a dialogue, again, with the obelisk. So the wrap, essentially, you know, it kind of blurs the lines between archaeology and the everyday, between past, present, and future. Okay, so the next point in the constellation that I'll take you to is here. That spot aligns with what would have been the last few feet of the African journey. And today, this is a row of underutilized warehouses that conveniently is owned by the city. So the sea is a place of, is rich in terms of Afro-Brazilian traditions. And you often hear and see rituals happening at the shore. You don't see that here because the Guanabara Bay is very polluted. And so the question became, what could you do in this space to reconnect this circuit, this site with the sea, with its history with the sea? So we proposed actually removing one of the warehouses and forming a plaza here with a thin layer, a scrim of water that would reflect the sky, but also reconnect you visually with the sea and activate those traditions in this particularly significant site. So as this reflective surface sits above the water, it kind of creates a sensation of reflection, but also of play. This neighborhood doesn't have a lot of places for play. It doesn't have a lot of shade, so it's also offering a microclimate that's cooling in the Brazilian heat. So this layering of everyday and memory is important to this project. This coastline, they also asked that we think about a streetscape for the historic coastline. This coastline, not only touched the sea 100 years ago, but it touched Africa 100 million years ago. And so the ocean is kind of just the space in between them. And the street, symbolically, essentially, is the seam in between. So I began to kind of graphically explore this idea of a seam in the streetscape, the sort of ripping apart and stitching together the land masses. And the seam would offer room for planting in between and express a pattern that could be illuminated at night and made legible from the favelas above. Along one overgrown hillside, I proposed a series of seating, lookout points and paths that lace through the existing volunteer African species in the symbolic white to highlight the ancestors' presence, revealing the sectional relationship between 3 historic sites in this slave circuit. And then for smaller moments around the constellation, I referenced that symbolic wrap in the site furnishings that can at once function as a bench, as a planter, but also a surface for inscriptions. So we're speaking again directly to the everyday needs of the people that live there, descendants of this history, but also offering space to learn and to reflect. So together, that collection of site furnishings helped tell a story amidst the backdrop of everyday life. So I worked with a large-scale model to understand the relationship between these sites. So here you see the wrap. This geometry of the plaza now makes the entrance to the favela the central spine, essentially, of that wrap. You see the seam along the streetscape. The constellation continues to the favelas, from where the view, you can see out to the plaza and the scrim of water out over the bay. But in sum, this project is really a series of insertions. It's offering a context or a frame around the life taking place around it, because the implications of this history are very present every day. Upholding in each case that the memory itself lives in the cultural ecology of the city. So one more quick project. This is Africa Town, a neighborhood in Seattle. It's actually, the neighborhood is called the Central District. It's the only historically black neighborhood in Seattle. In the 1970s, it was almost 80% black, and today it's 12%. And so the question among people in their early 40s, late 30s, the generation that witnessed the dismantling of the neighborhood, was what is the chapter after gentrification? You could argue that gentrification is complete in this context. So what happens now? This group, the Africa Town Community Land Trust, they formed a land trust and started to buy property, attract investors, and work with the city to start to amass some amount of property in the Central District. And I was brought on through a series of different projects to help envision what does Africa Town even mean. So the word Africa Town, the name, they made up themselves. They said, okay, Chinatown, doesn't get gentrified the way that the Central District does, because you could wipe out every African American from the Central District and no one would ever know anybody was there. But so the concept of Africa Town really borrows from traditions of robust legacy of black neighborhoods, and saying this is a town, this is a place that can thrive. What does that look like today if you were to start making that from scratch today? So we did a series of design ciphers Cypher being a concept that's embedded in hip-hop culture as an approach to what is traditionally called a charrette. And one of the first projects that came out of those ciphers is called Coming Soon. This is a sign that is like so typical in the Central District today. Coming soon, new construction. We got your Porsche, we got your jogger, we got some dogs. This doesn't look like the Central District that people know. So what did we do? We made our own. We made fake coming soon signs to reflective of what was coming out of those design ciphers with people's images of what does an Africa town look like. So this is entirely fake. We made up fake icons of different companies, Africa town architects. We had like Timbuktu architects, Roots landscape architecture. But so it was really fun to hang around these signs, and because people would be like, "Whoa, is this gonna happen?" And I was like, "I think so, yeah." The part about making the logos was really fascinating because it started to beg the question of, okay, if this is actually going to happen, if Africa Town is going to happen, what kinds of companies need to be formed? How do we train ourselves to actually do this? So while it seems like a cute graphic design or conceptual thing, it actually prompted a lot of questions about economic development. So you go to the website also, and it continues the fiction. So there's Africa Town developers; they're the ones that are developing this project. You go to the website, and the fiction is all still there until you go to the events link, and the events link sends you to real information about Africa Town meetings, which is where the matrix kind of gets pierced through. So if you were in Seattle and during summertime last year, you'd have seen one of these signs, and they were kind of, peppered around the neighborhood, and it was really fun to see all the press kind of grappling with like, wait, what's about to happen? It was a really fun process. Another project that came out of the ciphers was a project at this parking lot. So again, kind of like Mander, you look at this parking lot and you're like, it's pretty ugly, but this is the most important space in the Central District. This is what the press likes to call ground zero for gentrification. People drive from an hour away from the suburbs who've been displaced to come and hang out in this parking lot. This is sacred ground. And Africa Town Community Land Trust was able to purchase this property, but they didn't have the funds to actually redevelop it. So what could they do in the interim? That was the question that they brought to me, to us. What can we do on a low budget to inspire people to help us think about what is possible? So this was the palette here that we were working with. So during the design ciphers, paint came up a lot. I mean, there's 30,000 square feet to cover. How are we going to touch all of that? Paint, essentially, is the only way. Even though paint was the major material proposed, there was something about concrete they really wanted. Concrete being this material that's not really associated with, community temporary installation projects. There's a symbolic nature to concrete that they wanted to have present. We're going to concretize our presence here. So there were three basically major programs that they wanted to incorporate, and that's what you see in the site plan. An outdoor living room, and that's where the concrete comes in. We did outdoor sofas in concrete and an outdoor community coffee table, an outdoor market to be able to kind of stage what a future, economic or retail corridor could look like in Africa Town, and then a space that could flexibly be used for recreation and pop-up programming for kids and playgrounds and that kind of thing, like moonwalk kind of thing. So we worked with formerly incarcerated people, formerly homeless people from the neighborhood who had never worked with concrete before, and gave them the task of building the outdoor living room. And it actually provided them with a task or a skill rather, that they actually have all gone on to continue working on small projects throughout the neighborhood, backyards and things, working with concrete. But it was something, it was something really empowering, actually, energizing about us all figuring out how to work with this material together. And the paint, we had a neighborhood paint day, and over 300 people came out to paint. We had a DJ, of course, you see the theme here, we have DJs at all of our events. So many pictures of cute kids, it was really hard to come up with a few. I like to call this the prettiest post office parking lot I've ever seen. So this site was still functioning as a retail and post office and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of coordination that we had to do. So this is the living room, kind of still under construction. Got some plants in there to soften it up a little bit. Mayor came out for a ribbon cutting. You kind of see here I think there's a better picture of the coffee table. So this is before, this is after. Even after the painting, we started to look at the architecture different. We were like, oh, that building's kind of interesting. This is the opening day. We had a huge outdoor potluck, which as a landscape architect, I never thought one of my jobs would be to organize a 300-person potluck. It was. This is before, this is after. So the coffee table, we epoxied, we had community members offer their images from the neighborhood, and we epoxied them onto the top of the coffee table. And the site has continued to have life of its own. Now it has its own programming and funding and lots of activities for everyday life. I'll end on this diagram. This is a diagram from the Rio de Janeiro project of the baobab tree. Afro-Brazilians say that its roots grow horizontally, and they grow under the Atlantic Ocean to touch the baobabs on the African continent. The baobab is one of those species that's considered non-native, but again, through the process of that project in Rio, it was approved for planting. And it was installed just next to the Valongo site 2 weeks before the Olympics. It's a very small win in the context of all the things I presented. But it was a meaningful one, and I want to end on it because, I just want to call attention to the potential here, right? That, especially going back to kind of the beginning and thinking about students today and what you're being faced with in your education, or what the opportunity you have in your education and subsequent careers, to engage productively with people, with culture, and with memory, to interpret the experiences and expressions of space, with the goal of expanding what we're capable of in design. So in the context of these large challenges of the breakneck speed of urban development, of wide-ranging threats of a changing climate, and clarified, frankly, racial and political tensions, these are the contexts that you will increasingly work in. So in that context, I implore you to not forget people's stories and the small wins, and to listen closely to the stories that are least told. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So now, what's become a little bit of a ritual, which is if anyone needs to leave, no harm, no foul, go ahead, go quietly, and the rest of us will engage in a Q&A. You got 30 seconds.
I grew up in Louisiana, and so, a lot of my earliest memories are formed around tradition and ritual. And so, but then when I think about design culture, and, I don't see a lot of the past, or I didn't as a student. I felt like, and then, in the context of post-Katrina especially, trying to understand how design, the design discourse I was learning about had anything to do with the things that were most important to people, it just seemed like a huge question mark to me. I searched for design literature. I didn't find enough that spoke to how the past could be generative. And so that's where my mind went and continues to find productive. I think there's a lot there to explore. And the way that I want to explore that is through practice. And art, I found that landscape architecture is a tradition that's really tied to precedent. Like, that's how we understand what's possible, but those precedents are bound by cultural assumptions, and they're formed in the context of particular cultures. And so art is maybe an excuse to break from those typologies and that way of thinking about precedents. It gives me some reference for how and why to do that.
So you listen to these meetings and stories that don't listen to. Have you found that it's a barrier to try and get funding then to give other people to listen to you and say, this is important to do? And like, how do you overcome that?
I have seen a change in the last 5 years. So I started keeping up with landscape architecture about 15 years ago. And in the beginning, I was like, how am I ever going to make a way for myself in this field? But in the last 5 years, I feel like that has actually become more of a conversation. And I actually see clients in cities asking for things. So it's a challenge for sure, but it's a challenge that I think is being invested in more and more. So I'm hopeful.
So the Houston neighborhood seems like a really common example of a type of settlement that happens in subways in urban areas. That makes me think of these ideas of climate change and strategic retreat. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that, because it's exactly those kinds of neighborhoods are where the ones that are not really disaster, but also that have lack of investment. These are the places that are most likely going to be retreating from.
Yeah.
So how do you or how do you approach that, those kinds of well-being attitudes?
Yeah, I think, and this is a part of my work that is still developing and that I want to explore more, but I think that memory has something to offer about how we deal with strategic retreat in the following way. A lot of the places that Africans were taken from were in river valleys, because that's where Europeans had access to. They would just go up, use the river to go inland, take people and bring them here. And those settlements that they were being taken from were actually basically, you know, if you think about what urbanism was in America at that time, basically bustling metropolises compared to cities in America at the time. We're talking settlements of 15,000 to 20,000 people in places that exhibit these kinds of conditions. They're flooding, they're muddy, they're in a river, in a floodplain. And those were highly adaptable, they were building highly adaptable communities and architectures. And there's, so we want to talk about precedent, and I think there's actually a lot to look at, and particularly, you know, that brings conceptually and historically those communities together, but it also actually offers a lot in terms of how we might structure the design of those places. I'll leave it at that before I delve into like too much more random information, but I think there's a lot in a lot of different cultures historically that we can reference. We don't have to start from scratch with that question, I don't think.
So I'm a fourth-year landscape architecture student, and I So my question would be, since you know that like for landscape design, what client think or what the audience or what the public think is a really important part. Meanwhile, in the fine art area, like what the artist thinking is like the primary like the primary like point. So how do you balance with that?
This is a really good question. Again, the great questions. You're right, and you know, I think we ended up offending both traditions. Both I do both landscape architecture and public art because I personally think there's somewhere in the middle, and I know that sounds like an easy way out, but I feel like there's a pendulum that has swung. Like, so let's say in the last 60 years, architecture and planning has started to talk more about doing work that speaks to the community. But in the process of that, I think they've been almost riddled by their own guilt for urban renewal and the interstate system and all of the bad things that urbanists have done, and absolved themselves of some responsibility or agency as designers. And art, on the other hand, maybe gives themselves too much agency sometimes. And so what I'm interested in figuring out is, I started with the slide that said interpretation, and that word is useful for me to think about what that middle ground looks like. That we are both, you know, observing and listening, but at the same time we're active members. We're an active, creative engine for interpreting. I'm not hiding from the fact. I'm not going to say like, hey, this is what you said. This is the community. No, we interpreted what was said, what we observed, and the product and what we're aiming for is a responsible and resonant interpretation. So I'm trying to do both. Whether it's possible or not, I'm not sure, but it's productive for me.
Because I think I can see from especially from the last project you showed us, the African Town. Yeah. With all the like colorful paint, like I feel, especially doing the like few photos from the public work day or like what is it?
The paint day,
Yeah, the paint day. I feel like all the audience or the business really got involved in. Like I feel that's really successful.
There was this moment in the Philadelphia project too, where the last event we showed the final project, the final landscape design. There was a guy that who had never been to any of the meetings, but he was like, well, there's only 6 bathrooms, and da da da. And this woman got up and she was like, look, Daryl, you haven't been to not one of these meetings. This is our work. We've been coming to these things. We did the collages. We did this. And like, you need to, and then the guys came and they like shuffled him along out of the room. And I was like, woo! But to me, that was really important to me, to know that like, it's not like she drew it, but she saw herself in it enough to be defensive about it. And so that was really a really important moment for me to be like, okay, something is working, you know.
Thank you.
One more question?
Sarah, thank you so much. I'm thrilled at this work. It's so inspirational for myself and for students. Just history, culture, layer, meaning, interpretation, and they can't see this kind of stuff, and it's great. So my question, though, for you is something that Eliza led in today. Could you share your heart?
Yeah, it's not as interesting. It was quite the lead up. We were in Seattle, and we didn't like Seattle. And we were 3 people at the time. We're only 4 now, but so we made a list of cities. Everybody got to put names on a list, and we just battled it out between cities. And Harlem won for a number of reasons. I mean, you know, the amount of cultural, historical output of a single neighbor is just unmatched. And in a lot of these projects and places that we've worked in, Harlem is always a reference for people. This could be the Harlem of the South, or the Harlem of, you know. And so it has this like like mystical kind of presence. And it faces, at the same time, it faces a lot of the issues that the places that we're working in also face. So, you know, then there's like random facts like there's 3 airports, good for attracting talent. But anyways, we did the pros and cons, battled it out between the 3 of us, and we all moved to New York this summer. And now you guys are all welcome to come by and see us. We have a storefront gallery space that, you know, we don't want to be just the architects at our desks, or that just come out to the community meetings that we're planning in all these places. We want our actual space to be a community space. So we have this storefront gallery where we're curating, we're working with community partners, we're building those partnerships now to have exhibitions, but also a lab space essentially for people in the neighborhood that want to come and charrette an idea with us. So 2020, we're going to do that quarterly. Mixed in with other programming, but it's something that we're going to test and explore more about. How does this kind of design practice have a presence in its physical neighborhood in a meaningful way? It's another test that we're pursuing. So come by and see us.